but I thought I might sort of skip a little bit first and then come through a question to
No problem. I will guard it religiously.
And don't let me leave without
Yeah, I
it.
was going to say, if you get my CAD without it,
I'm
you'll know where to
gone.
find it. I have the exact same model too. So. Sure. Yes.
You'll be sitting on this side. That's what I'm moving on the far side. I'll help Mike you up.
Hi guys. Yeah, nice to see you. How's everything? Good to see you. How you doing? Good. These are great.
Professor
Great
Shanley
chairs.
from the Asian Society and the Japan
Oh,
Society.
wonderful. I love both these organizations.
Thank you.
Hi, good to see you. Thank you. My mic is live. Thank you. It's a big group. It's a good group.
Yeah.
That's great.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society. I'm Stephen Norper, Senior Director for Policy here at the Society. Just wanted to note that we have our calendar out. We have 11 policy events over the next 16 weeks. So we look forward to welcoming you all back, members of the Korea Society and the Japan Society, whenever we can see you. And for membership material, we encourage you to join both organizations for all our great programs. Thanks so much. And now President Tom Byrne of the Korea Society.
Well, thank you for coming today for today's discussion on the current challenges in Korean-Japan relations. Constructive and harmonious relations between Japan and South Korea are necessary for Northeast Asia peace and prosperity. The two remain America's most important and strongest allies in the region, and in the face of North Korea's challenges and a rising China, we need strong Korea-Japan relations. To explore the current situation and consider what role the U.S. should play, we have with us today Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, Chairman of the Korea Society, and Dr. Sheila Smith, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. As many of you know, Tom served as United States Ambassador to the Philippines and to the Republic of Korea, but he also has dedicated over half his professional diplomatic career to U.S.-Japan relations. Dr. Sheila Smith is a foremost expert on Japan, and her new work, Japan rearmed is impressive and was the subject of an excellent Japan Society program. Tom and Sheila, welcome back. And it is a pleasure to have you again on the stage for the third time, I believe, just to discuss Japan-Korea-U.S. relations. Sheila and Tom will have a dialogue for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So, Tom?
Well, thank you, Tom. And it's good to be here. It's good to see representatives of both the Japan side of the dispute and the Korea side of the dispute in the room together. And I think, as Tom said, Sheila and I have spoken on this topic here at least once or twice in the past. It is a long-standing topic and one that has been debated through the years. But I think we all can agree that perhaps we're at a time where trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and the ROK is as important as it has ever been, with the North Korea challenge still very palpable, with the rise of China creating various changes in the strategic situation in Northeast Asia, and at a time when we have two U.S. allies, two democracies, and two of the world's leading economies right there in the same region and calling for cooperation. Yet this problem, the dispute between Japan and Korea, I don't think has ever been more difficult or more challenging. Through the years, we've all dealt with various territorialist disputes and issues. We've dealt with the very serious humanitarian problems relating to the so-called comfort women, etc. But now, for the first time, I think we have this diplomatic and humanitarian set of issues spilling over very dramatically into the trade field, with Japan having curtailed the export or attached conditions to the export to Korea of some very important materials. We now have it affecting supply chains, not only between the two but not only between the two countries, but globally at a time of great uncertainties in trade wherever we are, and we also have it now spilling over into the security area with one of the positive developments over the last several years has been finally Korea and Japan signing an agreement called GSOMIA that allowed direct exchanges of intelligence between Korea and Japan, whereas up until now, much of that intelligence exchange had gone through U.S. channels. Now the Koreans have, in response, I think, to some of the measures the Japanese took, have announced their intention to withdraw from that agreement later this month. And on. Communication seems to be worse than it has ever been between the two countries. So I wanted to start out, Sheila, by asking you, why is it so much worse this time?
Well, thank you, Tom. I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank the members of the Korea Society and the Japan Society for joining us in this conversation. We have a lot of experts in the audience, and so I look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A session. This may be a series of conversations that we need to have, but thank you for coming. I'm here because I'm worried. I'm worried about the Japan-Korea relationship. It's not only very important to the United States, but it is just very important in Northeast Asia. And I think, Tom, as you pointed out, we are at a very rapidly changing geostrategic place in Asia. We don't have to demonize any one country in the region, but we understand that there are challenges, serious challenges ahead. And this is a time, I think, for the United States, Japan, and South Korea to try to find if we have common cause in meeting those challenges, or if we're really starting to see them in very different ways. It's a very big question. We don't want to answer it here, but I'm beginning to worry that, in fact, South Korea, Japan, and maybe even us, we are starting to see our strategic interests quite differently. And if that's the case, then we are in for a very difficult relationship beyond just the tensions that Tom outlined. I think one thing, and I think this comes from Tom's remarks as well, the ballast in the Japan-South Korea relationship, in other words, the interests that were in the relationship, and by this I mean the business leaders, business communities in both sides, the militaries and strategic planning communities in both sides, that ballast was always, if not always steady, it was always there to steady the relationship at times, as Tom said, when there were some political issues or tensions. And I think what we're seeing today is that ballast is eroded considerably. So inside the political communities in Japan and in South Korea, it is harder for people who have a conviction that the relationship is important. It's harder for them to make their voices heard in the politics in both countries, frankly. I think the other is, quite obviously, the United States may not be able to help in the same ways as it has in the past. We have a new president who is rethinking, or at least articulating, some qualms about our alliances, about whether they're in American interests or not. Now, the American people are overwhelmingly in support of both the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-ROK alliance. So I don't mean to startle everybody. But we all know that there's an ongoing conversation about burden sharing in the alliance and about whether or not our allies are doing enough for their own defenses. And that's equally visible in Europe, but it's also clearly visible in Asia as well. I worry, therefore, that our role may not be the same, and that both Tokyo and Seoul may be having expectations of us that in fact may not be realized. So I think there's a lot of dangers in this current episode that were not obvious and were not really at play in earlier episodes, and I'm worried.
Thank you. Sheila, let me just share a couple of anecdotes from the Korean side that might help broaden this discussion. I last was in Korea earlier this year, just as this crisis was beginning to become apparent. And I met with several of the big business leaders, the chaebol leaders, and each and every one of them appealed to me, I think in my capacity as chairman of the Korea Society, and perhaps thinking I might have some influence on U.S. government, appealed to me to, can't you solve this problem for us? Isn't there some way you can help us solve the problem? And my answer is, let's try. We'll see if obviously Korea and Japan, you have to solve it yourselves, but in the past, the United States has played something of a mediator, a convener role, and perhaps there's something we can do this time. One of the things that the Korean business side, was very concerned about was the Japanese this year for the first time declined to come to Korea for the annual dialogue between business leaders, between Keidanren and FKI or whatever the grouping was, and they thought partly because of Abe didn't want them to, but partly because they were concerned about, we haven't mentioned these court decisions, they particularly concerned about the court decisions, which are one of the new elements. And so, I came back thinking, can't we do something? And things kept getting worse and kept getting worse. But one of the people that I have long relied on for advice on Japan-Korea relations is now, like me, retired from government, but played a Korean diplomat who played a big role with Japan and in a variety of ways, and has continued to do it in retirement. And, he said, he was worried, deeply worried, as the business people were. And, he said, this time, in the past, almost all of these crises we've had have been as a result of something the Japanese did. Prime Minister visits Yasukuni Shrine, or textbook comes out, or somebody asserts the claim to Tokto Takeshima. He said, but this time, we started it. The Korean side started it with this court decision, and it's in the midst of a kind of a trying political time for us. It's much more difficult for us to solve the problem that way. I wonder if you had any.
So I think that's right. I think there's deeper causes at play here that are not necessarily going to respond to diplomacy. And by that, I certainly mean changes in South Korean politics itself and the institutional balance, for example, between the courts and the executive branch. There's a pretty obvious and strong tension. There are others here in the room more expert than I on Korean politics, but the institutional dynamics of Korean democracy are shifting. And this is, in some ways, Japan is getting caught up in part of that. The courts now are asserting themselves in ways over executive decision-making and diplomacy that are new to the relationship, was not part of the picture a decade ago. I worry a little bit about, again, the political capital that is easily available in both countries for a more rigid position on the other country. And again, I don't say that as one country is to blame, but it's a reality today. It is harder for friends of South Korea in Japan, and I assume friends of Japan in South Korea, to make the case for the relationship because of the sensitivities in both countries today. That takes very strong leadership to overcome. So that, again, I think puts the burden on the Kante and on the Blue House, in fact, to lead that process. I think we should give credit where credit is due in the last 6 to 9 months. There have been efforts by leaders on both sides to clarify the export restrictions, for example, to clarify the court cases, for example. On the 73rd anniversary of Korea's liberation, I think President Moon gave a very powerful statement of his desire for a better relationship with Japan. So there's no lack of intention, I think, in some ways to dampen down this dynamic, but it's going to take an awfully strong follow-through, I think, politically to make it happen. One thing I do think on the causality, too, is, again, to go back to the international context or the regional context within which this is happening. One of our guests today just said hello to me and said, it's so counterintuitive at this moment in Asia to have Seoul and Tokyo be at odds this way, right? But I think that demonstrates the intensity of this issue politically at home. And again, it may demonstrate a slightly different calculus in both capitals about China's role in the region, about the efficacy of our alliances. I don't know, but I do think there is an external calculus at work too that we don't often think about. We often go back to history. It's a long-standing dispute. But today, the strategic implications of these choices are being made. I mean, these choices are being made despite the strategic implications. And I think that's a very different piece of the puzzle. Can I add one last piece on this, Tom? And I think it's what we need to be very, very alert to, is that there are a number of countries in the region that could take advantage of this easily. And so that's not a cause, that's a consequence. And I think we saw it very quickly when Russia and China conducted their joint air patrol. And the Russians, not the Chinese, but the Russian surveillance aircraft, not once, but twice, went into the airspace over the disputed island. I won't name it in our sensitivities at the moment.
Liancourt Rocks.
Liancourt Rocks, okay. But that was deliberate. There's no other way to understand that than to say, let's test that animosity. Let's test and see just how much trouble we might be able to stir up. Now, I think that's a clear alarm bell for all of us. And I know in Washington, it was quickly conveyed to both Tokyo and Seoul that this is a moment of exploitation we shouldn't ignore.
Yeah, I agree with that last comment, and I think we're also seeing in our discussions with North Korea, et cetera, the result of this perceived tension. Obviously, the North Koreans now feel they have more kind of sway over South Korea than they did a few months ago, before, partly because I think of these disputes. I wanted to back up a little bit and philosophically. I'm glad Tom mentioned it because I was ambassador to Korea. I'm chairman of Korea Society, but I started out as a Japanese language officer and spent many years managing Japanese affairs as well as later Korean affairs in the State Department. And I've always felt that the Japanese, because of their very different democratic experience, kind of fail to recognize the power of democracy in Korea today. This is not your grandfather's South Korea, where you could go in and meet with the president and fix it, or meet with Kim Jong-il and fix it. It is a very vibrant democracy, and whereas in Japan, to be a little cynical, there's basically been one party rule ever since the end of World War II, with a few quickly abandoned exceptions. There's been one party rule. There's a very strong bureaucracy and bureaucratic tradition, and it's not a presidential system with separation of powers. In the case of Korea, there has been a number of changes in government, and as we've seen so dramatically in the United States, as the world has seen from the United States, elections have consequences, and you can't expect the same kind of continuity that has happened, partly because of the bureaucratic system, I think, in Japan. And there is a separation of powers. In the past, presidents have tried to manipulate the courts. In fact, that was part of, I think, the downfall of the previous of Park Geun-hye, the previous government in Korea. And there is a backdrop, and they've had this shift. So, I don't think you can expect the same kind of continuity. And I think, to be in my mind, the Japanese fail to quite recognize that, but partly because of their different experience and partly because of the colonial experience.
Can I respectfully disagree?
Good.
I think you're right. Single party dominance in Japan was the name of the game, but as of the early 1990s, in fact, that's pretty much been shattered. Now, the LDP has come back to power. I don't think there's anybody in Japan that doubts that Abe Shinzo leads a party that has been rejuvenated in opposition when they were away, when the DPJ took over.
Very short time.
It was 3 years, and that for the Japanese political history, that was a significant change. But all I'm saying, Tom, is that Japan is a parliamentary system. As you pointed out, Korea is a presidential system, so their dynamics are different. But I wouldn't take that to the step that Japan's democracy is weaker than South Korea's.
No, I didn't mean to say that.
Yeah, I just want to
as
know.
much.
I know you didn't, and that's why.
I didn't mean to.
It's a different system.
It's a different system,
Yeah.
and they've had different experiences in it.
But I think one of the arguments that it does come out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it does come out, I think, not just from conservatives, but from others in Japan as well, is that if we have to renegotiate difficult agreements every 5 years, in other words, every time there's a new president, then that's also very difficult. So again, we want to be very careful here, not to say one side or the other is at fault, but there are.
I didn't mean. I'm trying to address the question of understanding,
But I think you're right. There's structural differences in the way the government works in both sides, and that also affects the way in which the dynamics play out. But I think this round it's not the same. I don't think this is a question of elections. There is very little going to the polls in Tokyo based on the Japan-South Korea relationship, for example. There may be more electoral kind of ability to mobilize support in the Korean context about Japan than there is the other way around. I think if I had to put my kind of anecdotal kind of finger on the pulse antenna out here a little bit, in Japan it's a little bit slower. It's a slower kind of feeling that it's hard to work these issues through.
Yeah.
And we do have in both countries generational change. You know, we are considerably far away now from the actual events that much of these political discussions are focusing on. So there is a frustration on both sides in a younger cohort that also needs to be addressed. I am not one that thinks that all of the issues of historical memory can be negotiated. I mean, they are. We're talking about human. You were talking about emotion. Historical memory is long-standing. You can look to our country and our Japanese American experience here. It took several generations for that community to stand up and say, we were badly treated in the years during the war in the United States. It was unconstitutional. We need this to be addressed and acknowledged. And it took our Congress many years afterwards to be able to do that. And that's for Americans speaking to Americans. So I do sense that there is generations of conversation. It's changed over time. And if I would say one piece where I understand it's hard for Japanese, especially the Japanese government, is to figure out, well, what do we do about that, right? How do we address it? Not necessarily through diplomacy or a new agreement or throwing out the peace treaty or any of that kind of things that we think about in the diplomatic world, but how do you address it more substantially so that there's a place where you can have those conversations, right? And encourage younger Koreans and Japanese to have those conversations. Now, many of us here in the United States have Korean and Japanese students in our classrooms, and so we have a space where we can do that. I think it's much, much harder. And I think if I had if I could wave a magic wand, I would say that some of the constituencies in both countries, not necessarily the governments, but not exclusive of them, could take a much, much more strenuous leadership role in trying to create venues. And that's the corporate world. It could be the media. It could be universities, obviously, to create venues where the South Korea-Japanese conversation can happen without recrimination and without the kind of rigidity that we're starting to feel today. That's very hard to accomplish, but that's probably where places like the Korea Society and the Japan Society can perhaps help.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that I was so dismayed to see this rupture in the business community and the whole dispute having kind of spilled over into the trade area, because the business to business ties have been a very key part of the relationship and a place where this kind of dialogue you talked about has taken place. I've spoken several times in Japan,
Right.
on the same issue with Japanese always asking me, how can we figure out a way to deal with Korea better. So I think the business tie has been very important, and I hope we can patch that side up also. And the defense side, this Korea's decision on Jisomia was I think a very unfortunate one. It's symbolic of
Right.
closer Japan-Korea cooperation within the context of our trilateral relationship and our separate alliances, but also has had some very practical value,
Yeah.
particularly in trying to analyze what's happening with all these shorter range missiles that the
Right.
North Koreans are testing. It was working well and to our common benefit. So again, we need to find some way to get the military side back into.
It might be helpful to, I don't know if this audience pays a lot of attention to missile launches and in communications and intelligence communications, but for example, in 2017, the Jisomnia was absolutely crucial. And for the first time with all of those short range and then the ICBM tests that came with it, it was the first time that you really had synchronization of U.S. Forces Korea or U.S. ROK forces with U.S. Japan forces in Japan. And by that I mean, of course, there are deep sensitivities in South Korea, obviously, about having Japanese military forces on sovereign soil. But there was an awful lot of demonstration by the United States, Japan, and South Korea that should there be a conflict, don't miscalculate. Both of these alliances will be coordinated and they will respond. So that kind of signaling, the two alliances were quite synchronized in 2017. It was very effective. and respectful of the sensitivities of South Korea,
If I,
particularly.
you were implying that I was criticizing the Japanese, which I wasn't trying to do, but I think there's another gap in understanding. I think, virtually every Japanese policymaker and the public basically realizes that that Korea is very important to their national security. That the U.S. alliance with Japan in these days is to a large degree focused on Korea, and that's part of their national security. The Korean public does not, to an equal degree, recognize how important our military presence in Japan is to our ability to defend Korea, and it's always a very sensitive topic. But the Korean government, I don't think, has done enough to try to persuade its public of the importance of this trilateral relationship to them.
Now, a lot of our bases in Japan are UN designated bases, which were UN designated for a Korean contingency. I think it's also, we don't often think about this because thank goodness we don't really need to, but non-combatant evacuations from the Korean Peninsula, should there be a conflict, would all be going through Japan. And so there's a very deep enmeshing on both sides of that, not only forward deployment of U.S. forces, but also thinking about how a Korean contingency might affect all three countries, right?
The reason why we have all these problems over our facilities in Okinawa is they're there for Korea.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, so that's
It might also be useful, there are others in the room who are more expert on this than I am, but it might also just be important to be clear about the economic impact in addition to the security impact. If you start to see a disentanglement of Japanese and South Korean industries, I think the export restrictions, the items under the export restriction system could be a total of $6 billion worth of goods. I think it, again, bears clarification that the question that the Japanese METI was asking, it took a while for them to be clear about what question they were asking, to be sure. But the question they were asking is they understood how the South Korean export controls worked on WMD and missile, right? Especially the items related to missile capability. But they didn't understand how they were applied to conventional military goods. And that's the clarity that the Japanese were looking to get in the consultations. But there is an economic impact of not only the goods themselves, should they not be purchased anymore by Koreans of Japanese goods, but also the implications of the boycott, which, as you know, is pretty strong now. There's a lot of popular support for the boycott of Japanese goods in South Korea. So there will be ripple effects on the trading relationship between the two of them. And the disentanglement, if that becomes a real policy, diversification of sources, right? That will also add to the long-term economic impact for both countries. I think the message, though, Tom, I wanted to come back to the point you made early on, is the messaging to the global trading regime, if we want to call it that, is pretty strong.
Yeah.
And it's coming at a time when obviously we are challenging, right? A multilateral trading, the liberal order, as we use the shorthand for. There's just an awful lot of pressure today on our international trade, and then that will inevitably follow on our international finance. This is just one more pebble in that pond, but it's a very important one, very critical, signaling, right, of the willingness to disentangle if that becomes a strategic necessity. And I think it's worth just pausing there on the economic side because it too has strategic consequences, I think.
Yeah, please.
Lots of hands.
Stephen, you're going to,
John Wheeler, good to see you both. I just wanted to push a little bit, Sheila, on what you said. You said you were very worried. What you said was even more disturbing, that, beyond these differences, court decisions, comfort women, trade issues, that there may be fundamental strategic goals, values, priorities that are different. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? And also, if you could touch on some of the domestic political constraints, Mr. Abe and Mr. Moon, that negate them trying to be more conciliatory here.
I wrote a piece on CFR.org on July 1, largely because what I've been hearing over the years from both sides, right? Are very different ways of looking at what's happening in Asia, in particular China. I believe that, and again, there's plenty of people here to engage in this conversation with us, but I believe South Korea sees China as instrumental in what is a long-term Korean ambition, which is unification of the peninsula. And China matters to South Korea in a way today probably that it didn't matter a decade or so ago. As we all know, Japan looks at China and China's growing economic and increasingly demonstrated military power and sees concern. Now, Mr. Abe is leading a pretty successful diplomatic effort with President Xi. Doesn't mean that the Chinese and Japanese are at loggerheads, but I think the deeper vision of the country's national interests and the long-term sort of future vision of Asia may be quite different than what it was when it was focused on the threat from North Korea or it was a divided peninsula. So it's not all about China, but I do sense that there may be slightly different emphasis in the way that Seoul and Tokyo are now looking at the future of Asia. And that may also contribute to discounting each other as partners in a way that wasn't true in the past. The domestic politics, I'm going to leave to South Korean experts to speak on South Korean politics. My sense of what's happening in Japan is there is a popular, it's more of it comes from underneath. A lot of people assign this as Mr. Abe, and I just think that's wrong. I'm not saying he's an easy person for President Moon to deal with. They come from ideologically quite different positions, clearly. But it's important to remember that these difficulties are not just about a progressive government in Seoul and a conservative government in Tokyo. They go back to conservative governments in Seoul, and before that to progressive governments, and again to conservative governments. This has been coming despite political change in both countries. And the DPJ, even though it was a 3-year tenure and it was short-lived, they too had great ambitions for the Seoul-Tokyo relationship. It didn't end up working out the way they had hoped. So I think you've got political change in both countries, and both sides of the political spectrum are having difficulties trying to manage this changing relationship. What keeps Mr. Abe from reaching his hand out to Mr. Moon? Not sure that that's the way that Tokyo would see it. I think they're trying to be, the presentation is pragmatic. We have a question about export restrictions, right? The tit for tat narrative makes a lot of sense in both capitals, but each side thinks the other one began. You can take the moment to this act by the other party back one step further, right? I do think, though, that the court rulings last year present a considerable hurdle for the Japanese government. And even if it wasn't Mr. Abe as prime minister, I think the Japanese fully believe that the 1965 treaty did address the wartime mobilization of obviously forced mobilization of Korean laborers. I think what they've come down on is they began to talk about going to the international court, which is not constructive. And they've returned to the treaty itself to say we should open the mediation mechanism in the treaty to revisit this because we think we had solved that problem. So that is the formal position today of the Abe cabinet. And I think it's a desire, it's a sincere desire to look at that issue again. Because I don't think they see that the courts, repeated bringing individual Japanese companies to bear, to be accountable today is going to end up helping the relationship. So I do think we have to give the benefit of the doubt to both sides. I think it's hard to make the case in some cases in both capitals, but I think, as I said earlier, I think President Moon was trying. And on the 73rd anniversary of liberation of Korea, he was also trying to reach out and communicate to Mr. Abe that a pragmatic approach to the Japan-South Korea relationship is needed. Now, that means we have to figure out the de-escalation. But I do think that there is an opportunity if both political leaders insist upon it. But I think it's going to take a strenuous insistence on both sides.
Let me just add a little addendum on the Korean side. At least my view is that Abe does not gain politically from this dispute with Japan.
With South Korea.
Did I say?
So Abe doesn't
No,
benefit.
Moon doesn't.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
okay. President Moon.
I think this. I do believe a lot of Japanese kind of misunderstand that. He faces a situation where the main businesses at Chaebol can't stand him anyway. You know, and you know, he needs to. You know, it's important, I think, to his position going into elections next year and going on, that there be greater stability in Korea's international relations with the United States, which is most important. Abe doesn't gain, Moon doesn't gain from a dispute with Japan, but he would lose a whole lot if he seemed to be caving in the dispute with Japan. It's kind of a negative kind of political pressure, and it makes it very difficult for him to solve it. I saw a respected Korean academic wrote an op-ed, I think last week, suggesting that as a start on trying to solve this treaty issue, that somehow Moon find a way to reiterate that Korea still supports and finds valid the 1965 treaty. There's simply a legal dispute over what it covers.
Implementation, right?
And because I think part of the Japanese distrust, and when you talked about agreements kind of in plural, is I think that is a basic agreement, and it needs to be upheld, and it would I think be a start towards solving all these problems for the Korean side to recognize that.
And both parties in 1965 recognized that this peace treaty could, in the future, have people who made claims on it.
Yeah.
So they built in a mediation
Yeah, that's
mechanism.
right, exactly.
And so there is a mechanism there to be used. But it'll take that kind of political leadership, and it'll be hard for both. But I think it's worth giving it a
It'd
shot.
be hard for him to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Professor Kevin Shanley from the Japan and Asian Society, and I've enjoyed this discussion very much. But when I attend these, I always come away with the feeling that enough attention is being paid to the historical baggage in both these countries, Japan and South Korea, going back 3 centuries. And it's not a good one. That's enough. That's just a comment. I have more a question, informational question. Who initiated the business dispute? I understand that Japan did. I could be wrong. If they did, could you care to comment on what might have been their motivation for doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look broadly at the business dispute, I think you have to go back to the court decision that found that people had valid claims against Japanese corporations, some of which still exist. So, I mean, I think that's kind of where it started. And it's kind of been there for a long time anyway, because this issue has been floating out there. I think the next big step was when the Japanese government, ostensibly having questions about Korea's export control system, imposed restrictions, imposed additional requirements for exports of 3 specific products that are very, very key to the IT industry, where Korean and Japanese companies are really quite closely integrated, and kind of went on from there. But I think you have to. I guess I'm an American, so I've got to say, I think that decision surprised us all. I don't think anybody, Sheila, was anybody anticipating that export control step. I think it caught us by surprise. I think the U.S. government might have been more outspoken on that if we'd known it was coming, because it affects supply chains all over the place.
I think there isn't one business dispute, and I guess that's just a reiteration in a slightly different way of what Tom was saying. But I do think that the Japanese government feels that the court cases bring in liability for all Japanese companies, especially the ones who have foreign direct investment longstanding, as you know, in South Korea. So it's not just the two court cases of the fall, but also the implication, the domino,
Yeah,
perhaps,
right.
effect of all Japanese companies in South Korea then could be liable to have their assets nationalized, right, if they didn't conform to the Supreme Court ruling. And I think that's where the Japanese government takes the issue that we negotiated this back in 1965 explicitly. And let's go back to the terms of that treaty, because we can't open up all of our businesses in South Korea to this kind of court decision making. So there again, there's that judiciary versus executive tension, branch tension in the South Korean articulation on this compensation issue. And so that's one kind of meta context. The export restrictions, I didn't see it coming, but that doesn't mean that others in Washington didn't. This has been a request, and again, the export restrictions list is a new export restriction control regime for Tokyo. It was, I believe it goes back to 2004. Somebody can correct me if that date is off. But it's not that Japan had these going way back to the 50s, but it was done largely to control exports to North Korea. So it was largely to make sure that there was oversight for sanctions, both by unilateral sanctions, but also UN-sponsored sanctions on North Korea. What I think METI didn't do at the beginning when the export restrictions were announced is they didn't clarify what the issue is. They were frustrated because they said the South Koreans weren't providing the information they were looking for. So it began at a very procedural level. It didn't begin in a meta, but it very quickly, right, escalated. And so the Japanese could have probably done it, I think, not could have, they should have done a better job of having this not go from the working level to the announcement by the cabinet, but the working level to the next stage to try to get it on the agenda. But as I said earlier, what I understand METI was concerned about is that they were not clear in the South Korean export control laws, separate laws, right, what kind of implications or review processes were in place for conventional weapons. They understood the process for WMD and for nuclear-related missile delivery systems, but they didn't understand what was in place for the conventional. Now, that took 6 weeks to come out from the Japanese side. So you see there's a lack at what could have been handled better by both countries at the procedural level. It took a little bit more of this kind of pressure to emerge. I will say, the context, the larger political context, is more at issue, I think, here than the business specifics. If they decided to fix the problem, it would be fixable, right? With more information and more clarity. And some people in the media refer to these as sanctions, but they're not sanctions. So South Korea was taken off a kind of privileged category. And now the same kind of trade can happen, but it has a 90-day waiting period. That's it. So it's not like export restrictions, we're not going to export these materials to South Korea or allow South Korean companies to purchase them. It's that now they go from no questions asked to 90 days. So again, there's a lot in the media that the narrative got exploded very quickly. The diplomacy got exploded very quickly. Behind it reflects this trust issue. And I think this question over compensation really lays at the bottom of it.
Nick Brandt, member of the Korea Society Board. On your last point, are the 90 days being fully exploited, or is the process actually being accelerated?
I think right now they have just, and I can't give you the exact date, Nick, but it's like as of 3 weeks or so ago, South Korean exports went from having kind of carte blanche to now having to apply for permits for the 90 days. Like everybody else, in fact. I mean, South Korea was one of the few countries that were treated carte blanche in the past. So it's the reduction in the preferences given. It's not sanctioning. But that's of course awkward if you are a Samsung or any other country that wants to quickly, get access to your supply chain. You don't need to have that, or you don't want to have that. But I suspect on many of these issues, the big one being the treaty, to go back to the court cases and the treaty, data, information, agreement, treating at a procedural level could actually solve much of this. But the choice has been not to treat it procedurally.
Thank you. My name is Masatoshi Nagata with Kyoto News of Japan. Glad to see you. The title of this discussion is Korea-Japan relations and the U.S. role, and you've been talking about the bilateral Korea-Japan relations. What about the U.S. role? What exactly do you expect from the U.S.? What steps do they have to do it? And do you think the current Trump administration is capable of doing it? Thank you.
You want me to go first? Or you can go. You're the ambassador. You can go first. I'm the academic. I can say anything.
Having been in government, I've been part of these efforts to ameliorate and mediate, and I think we have been much more active on that prior to the Trump administration. I know I was not part of the Obama administration. I was ambassador to Korea under Bush, and we tended to pick up on these things very quickly, jump in and try to bring about a resolution. But I have to say I don't. One, I think the Trump administration was somewhat slow on the uptake in realizing how serious the problem was, and the president himself has, I think, sort of minimized our capability of helping them deal with it, and we have not done some of the things that rhetorically and behind the scenes that we might have done. I think we could have. I said way back when the export restrictions were first imposed, I said, the U.S. ought to call for a consultation, have a consultation on the specifics of what these issues are there genuine complaints? And nobody did that, I don't think, in any vigorous way. And nobody's been trying to. But I think the way Trump has used tariffs as a means of solving other problems outside that field has made us less holy, less pure on these issues, and it made it more difficult, I think, for us to weigh in. And equally, as Sheila said earlier, we do feel very strongly about the effect on our intelligence exchange. And we've been pretty outspoken about that. That is something we have a real stake in as ally of both countries, and as part of the leader in trying to kind of deal with the North Korean issues. It was easier for us to speak out on that, but even there, I think the various pressures that we're putting on our allies for more host nation support, fewer military exercises, all of the kinds of things that Trump has done in the military area have frankly diminished our influence.
I agree with all of that. The U.S. role has traditionally been most conspicuous in the military strategic area, and we mentioned already why the bases in Japan, the bases in South Korea are linked to our ability to cope with, not only to deter aggression, but to cope with any potential aggression in the region, be it against South Korea or be it against Japan. Equally important that those forces and that force posture be maintained and supported. So there's always been that aspect, and so that's a very strong piece of the trilateral relationship, and that's why the GSOMIA, the decision not to renew GSOMIA, goes directly at the heart of that ability our ability to operate, our forces' ability to operate. It weakens all of our security, American, Korean, and Japanese. So that's a big piece, and I expect that that will continue to be, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, Randy Shriver, made that point very clear when South Korea made that decision. But there had been communication. There was a flagging of GSOMNIA being at risk since the export restriction issue was announced by Japan. So you could see that this was in the mix and it was coming. There was plenty of private communication on the costs of that decision. But the U.S. role has also been, and Tom was part of it over various administrations, has been to try to help Japan and South Korea at moments of friction and tension. Whether you had President Obama in the facilitating role with Park Geun-hye and Abe Shinzo, right, or whether it went earlier on, we've always wanted a stronger relationship between South Korea and Japan. And Republican and Democratic administrations alike have worked at that always. This administration's liability is there's very few people on the ground at the level to do that kind of work.
That's right. We didn't have a confirmed
We just got our
Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs at the State Department until a month ago. And that has been the level where we've probably been most active in dealing with this issue.
We didn't have an ambassador in Seoul for a long time. Our ambassador in Japan has left that post. So at the level at which the antenna would have been out for these kinds of difficulties earlier, specific issues, not the whole relationship, we didn't have people there that could help.
Hi, my name is David Hume. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Mike, I have kind of a two-part question, and the first part is that my understanding of the Japanese, the perspective of the Japanese side is that they will impose like more export restrictions or whatever it might be if the assets are choose to be liquidated on the Korean side. On the Korean side, this is kind of in the gears of the legal system and in the Supreme Court. And so from that perspective, it seems like the status quo is things kind of get worse. So first part of the question is do you agree with that? Secondary to that is that, from that perspective, what can the Koreans do on their side if the ball's kind of in their court to de-escalate this?
So let me just comment on where what your description of the status quo. I am not aware that the Japanese government has a strategy with these export restrictions to punish South Korea over the court cases. So that's not what my understanding of the Japanese approach. What I believe the Japanese government approach is to invite South Korea to use that negotiating mechanism in the 65 treaty to get at the root cause of the concern. I do think, though, if you start to see an economic disengagement, Japan is just as easily capable of participating in that. So I think that would be a mutual set of tit-for-tat responses. But my understanding is the Japanese government's core concern is the implementation of the 65 Treaty and how to rectify that. Now, I do think you're right that, we all said earlier, the courts and the executive branch in South Korea do not agree. And I don't know how to resolve that problem, but there does need to be some consideration, I think, of what that implication is in the Japan-Korea relationship separate from that. That's kind of an internal domestic politics issue that I don't know how to bridge, or if it's even bridgeable, to be honest. But at the end of the day, I do think that left alone, so status quo means nothing's changing, but things have been changing every week, right? We now have a new decision of health and welfare officials in South Korea to up the investigation of food products from Japan because of the Fukushima radiation, interpreted in Tokyo as tit-for-tat retaliation. Completely separate incidents, by the way, completely legitimate decision to make. But everything now is being pushed into this basket of this tension between the two countries. I would suggest the first place is to stop, take a breather, and have both political leaders decide to stop and take a breather to see if there's a mutual way to bridge this so that the escalatory pattern doesn't continue. So I don't think we're at a status quo. I think we're at an escalatory interaction, and I think that's the first thing that needs to happen is to stop.
My name is Yuli Khan. Thank you. When I look at having looked I think the crux of the issue is a lack of trust and unresolved historical history. To me, there's a very big wide disparity in knowledge. For example, any Korean who grew up in Korea, raised in New Brunswick, and March 1st, 1919. You ask 1,000 Japanese, let's say you ask them from Tokyo, Kyoto University, Waseda, here, Toshikashi, they wouldn't know. There's a big knowledge gap. The Japanese have never asked themselves the question. After World War II, the Axis power Germany was divided, but we weren't divided, but the neighboring country Korea was divided. Why was that? The role that Japan had in Korea. Actually, Japan annexed Korea from 1905 until officially 1910, but for 40 years, the result was very divisive Korean society. And when the Japanese surrendered in May of 1945, and they surrendered in August, it gave the room for Stalin to come in. And as soon as Soviet troops entered Hamgyong-pukto and present-day North Korea, that was the start of division. So my question is that this lack of understanding and this lack of knowledge on Japan's side, putting aside the comfort movement. So what can the Ministry of Education? Why is not the Ministry of Education in Japan teaching this type of history? They put so much emphasis on teaching, for example, it's Hudson Rebellion, the Choshu Rebellion, but they don't put the same amount of emphasis in teaching this part of education in the 20th century. If you could please explain on that. I think that would go a far ways in terms of improving Korea-Japan relationships. I really do.
So I can't explain why the curriculum is the way it is. I can explain the mechanics of the textbook selection, which we all probably in this room probably are aware of. It's a centralized educational system. The Ministry of Education selects textbooks that it approves of that can then be used by Japanese schools. Private schools have options, right? More options than public schools do. The controversy that worsened the Japan-Korea relationship is when some of the textbooks that emerged in the 1980s were quite revisionist in terms of Japan's wartime history. So the textbooks teaching and educational curriculum can work both ways, right? It can enhance certain viewpoints over the others, right? It can make things worse rather than making things better. There have been some spectacularly good studies. I'm forgetting his name, Professor Kim in Stanford, and Dan Snyder did a fantastic comparison of Asian textbooks generally in terms of their ability to teach history. And forgive me, Professor Kim, if you're watching, I've forgotten your first name, but your work is tremendous. He also just wrote a piece at ASPARC at Stanford on the current round of tensions, which was also excellent. Gilk, that's right. I'm sorry. Thank you for that. But it's not just Japan, Korea, and how they teach history. And I take your point. You've lived in both societies. You can see where the shortcomings are. I think it's also true that if you compare it across the board, we could probably encourage people there to do a better job across Northeast Asia on a shared understanding of history. And I think that's the difference between what is in the textbooks in Japan versus what is shared with neighbors. And because history has been so politicized, the Japanese scholars have engaged in multiple attempts to have collective history writing, to engage scholars from China and South Korea. But the political movement to move that enterprise forward has not continued. So I don't know the answer, I guess, is the short answer to your question, but I doubt that any two countries are going to end up teaching the exact same history. Our history is not the same history, 20th century history that gets taught. I have to remind Americans that Japan and the United States rose in the 20th century together, that the story of Asia is not about Japan's rise alone. It's also about ours and the competition, right, that created in the Pacific. So we need historians, I think, to do a good job of educating our young people in all of our societies if we're going to look at the future of the Asia Pacific together in a more peaceful and not so contentious way. But I appreciate your question and your comment. Thank you.
Thanks. Joan Wargo from Columbia Law School Center for Korean Legal Studies. I wanted to get back to the issue of mediation, the clause in the agreement. My understanding is that Japan did make an offer and the Koreans rejected that. And so I was wondering why the Koreans rejected that. And if you would see that arbitration would be a way forward for both sides to de-escalate and save face.
That's easy. I would say yes to that. I would really, really like to see that happen, but I don't know why South Korea doesn't want.
You know, frankly, I don't either.
Yeah. Somebody else in the room might, but I don't.
Saw the issue as it arose. I think probably relates to some degree to separation of powers in Korea and the role of the judiciary, which is somewhat different than in Japan. It relates partly to politics. I think accepting that would have been seen by Moon's opponents as some kind of cave, and taking a chance that they don't have to take. But
since you're a legal scholar, let me ask you a question in reverse, if you don't
Yeah.
mind. So there are a lot of countries that have gone to war and negotiated peace treaties that have then perhaps questioned those peace treaties. Maybe not a lot, but we do have some after World War II, right? It might be an interesting contribution to the current conversation to put this in comparative perspective. So if other countries have had these, 50 years, 60 years since re-question, I'm not putting you on the spot to answer the question now, but I think that would be an excellent contribution to understanding, is this particular to Japan and South Korea? Or are there exits and possibilities here that could be learned from other countries who've faced the same?
just as a little addition to that, we often sort of equate the 1965 Japan-Korea agreement to the San Francisco Peace Treaty that had a similar clause about claims. But I think there is a distinction between the Japan-Korea Normalization Agreement, which wasn't a peace treaty ending a war. It was settling a colonization in effect, and the San Francisco Treaty, which indeed was a treaty between nations that had a war together and needed a peace. So I think I'd be interested in your comments, but I think the context is somewhat different. Japanese argue, for example, that everybody was colonizing back then. Colonizing wasn't illegal. Whereas wars are wars, and you do have to settle wars in some way.
I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know if that's legally would be the right interpretation. But what I do think is important is the San Francisco Peace Treaty did set the table in many ways for Japan's other peace treaties, and that's Indonesia and Korea, and then ultimately the PRC. And the San Francisco premise, in the same as it was in Germany, right, is no reparations. Yeah. Because reparations in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I had so created the problem that led to World War II. So there was a mindset, I'm not sure it's legal doctrine, but after World War II, the idea was not to impose punishing costs on the countries that lost. And that was an experience that came out of, again, World War I. But instead to encourage the kind of side agreements that came out of both San Francisco and the Korea Agreement and the Indonesia Agreement and then all of Japan's subsequent agreements with the countries who weren't at the table in San Francisco, right? And it was even there for the PRC.
That's an important
so
point.
There's some premises here. It may not be legally on the same footing, but there's some interesting premises here. And that's the premise that's getting questioned by citizens taking to court in South Korea and to some extent in China as well, taking to court their grievances over they were not compensated, right? Well, who made that decision? It was, in the end, it was their governments that made that decision in the negotiating process. So you've got a complex mix here that it's not just about Japan, Korea, but also China. It's also about other countries, I suspect, and in other settings as well. But I think legal scholars have an important role to play here. So look forward to reading more of your work.
Well done. was I think our hour is up now, so we'll end.
Yes.
And so thank you for your illuminating, insightful, I think fascinating discussion
Thank you.
of this issue.
Thank you.
Hopefully there will be constructive resolution soon. Harmonious and prosperous Northeast Station. So thank you again, and thank you all for coming here for this program. Well, anyway, and as I always mentioned, please consider joining thank you all who are members of the Korea Society, and thank you for the board directors who showed up today. But for those who are not members, please consider a very modest amount for paying membership to help us provide more programs of this nature. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done.